Mr. Horsfall, greetings. Great to see you in First Western. Thank you for being in our program.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine said that Russian army had lost more than 300,000 personnel in combat. What does it mean for both sides of the war?
Well, if we think about how much Ukraine has achieved, they've actually eliminated the equivalent of 5 British armies, 300,000 casualties to the Russians is an enormous achievement. But they're not so concerned about how many people they lose as what they want to achieve, whereas the Ukrainian armed forces are concerned about protecting their men, keeping their soldiers as safe as possible, using them effectively. So this is one of the big ideological differences between the two sides. But the loss of 300,000 men, especially trained men, cannot be underestimated. The loss of that number of people is going to have a detrimental effect on Russia's ability to continue the war.
It seems like significant development for both sides of the war, even for Russia. How could it influence the support of the war by Russian population?
The unfortunate thing about the Russian population is they are people who have always got a gun to their head. If they resist, they get arrested or they disappear. And that goes all the way from the normal man in the street all the way up to the generals in charge of their armies. So many people, if they were speaking privately, would like to resist, but being organized as a resistance organization is almost impossible for them. They're under the thrall of Vladimir Putin, and that's the way, unfortunately, it's going to stay. It's the Russian autocratic system. So, you know, it's a war that has to be won. The Ukrainian people began this war defending their own country, but now they're not just defending their own country; they're defending Western democracy. They're defending the ideology of free people around the world. And everybody in the world needs to be reminded that that's exactly what they're doing, and they need our support continuously. I wrote 20 months ago that Ukraine has given its blood and we must give our treasure. And because we can't send our forces in to directly support yours at this moment, then that's the best we can do, and we must do it to the full extent.
As fighting continues on the ground, how could you assess current situation on the front lines?
Yeah, I think the front line is moving forward. It's not what most of the observing world would like to see. They would like to see a wonderful counteroffensive that breaks through and rolls up the enemy from the side and it's all over by Christmas. Well, wars don't happen that way, and anybody that reads history knows that large conventional wars like this take a long, long time. But Ukraine is winning this war. It's winning it on land, sea, and air. The Black Sea Fleet has retreated back to Russia. They're out of Sevastopol. The Russian Air Force cannot fly effectively without being shot down by ground-to-air missiles. And the land forces are pushing holes through the very, very strong Russian defenses, but gradually. But behind the scenes, the Russian economy is failing. Europe is not buying their oil. They cannot ship enough of it out to maintain their economy. The ruble is worth less than 1 cent now. So inflation is running wild in Russia. So Russia is losing on all fronts. And that's the reason that they've instigated the Hamas attack in Israel.
We will move back and cover with you the maritime warfare and Israel-Hamas war, but I would like also to ask you about challenges for Ukraine's counteroffensive operation in the winter. What are the challenges for the Ukrainian army to conduct counteroffensive in the winter season?
Well, wet winter warfare, which is really in Ukraine talking about your autumn period when the temperature's just above zero or just below zero. So everything gets wet. You've got your mud. You've got the cold. So it's a very difficult environment to maintain soldiers in for a long period of time. The good thing about the Ukrainian armed forces, they're rotating their troops into the front line for a few weeks, out of the front line to rest for a few weeks. The Russians put their people in and they leave them there until they die. Living in that kind of environment, it's important to have good trenches, good accommodation, good shelter from the rain, dry places that you can get warm again, good food and good clothing. And again, the Ukrainian equipment is better, it's superior, it's waterproof, it's warmer, and your rations that are being supplied are, again, a better level of food, a better level of support. And so their morale is going to say much, much higher, because nothing breaks down morale faster than the cold and hunger.
How could you assess current morale of the forces of both sides of the war, and how could it be influenced by the upcoming winter?
The Russian morale is extremely low. They know that they're being put into a meat grinder every single day. They feel that nobody cares about them. They accept almost that they can either die or surrender. If they retreat, they're being shot by their own forces. There can't be anything worse for morale than that. They are supplying their own clothing. They're supplying their own equipment to stay dry. So Russian morale is extremely low, whereas the Ukrainian soldier is fighting for his family, fighting for his homeland. He feels that he has the moral high ground anyway, and his morale is very high because his morale is being fed by victories. It's being fed by leadership that is extremely competent and doing very, very well. General Zaluzhny is an absolutely first-class general, and he's looking after his men. He's winning victories, and victories create higher and higher morale. And your president is the perfect example of integrity, courage, and setting a good example to his people. He leads from the front. He inspires his whole population. Not only does he inspire Ukraine, but he's inspired Europe to come together against a common foe. He's inspired NATO to start spending money again, and he's inspired the democracies of the free world to support Ukraine. And that's an incredible thing to achieve.
Despite huge losses on the ground, Russia has launched its offensive on Avdiivka. This offensive failed, but why is it even still possible for Russian side to conduct such full-scale offensive operation on the ground?
Yeah, it's possible because they keep conscripting more men into their armed forces, and they pick up the weapons of the dead men and they send them back into battle, and they're not worried about how many they lose. And that's the only reason they can keep going forwards. But at some point in time, that supply of young, fit men has got to run out. The supply of trained men has already run out. Their trained armed forces have, say, taken such great losses that there's very few of them left. So, you know, those losses are extremely damaging to their ability to maintain and continue the war. The only thing that's maintaining and continuing the war at the moment is the prepared defenses that they put in underground last winter. And holding on to that ground is all they seem to be able to do. And Putin is hoping that if he can drag the situation out long enough, that the world will grow tired of it. And I take it as part of my mission to make sure that the world doesn't grow tired of it. The world remembers what's going on every single day, which is why I write about it almost every day.
Also, Russia has suffered significant losses on Avdiivka battle. In your opinion, how could it influence ground situation in the long-term perspective?
I don't think it is strategically important. It's important from a psychological point of view. Russia would like to take Avdiivka before Christmas and say what a wonderful success they've had and make an enormous thing out of it. But strategically, it's one town close to Donetsk, which they've focused on the same way that they focused on Bakhmut. and they lost huge numbers of people there. Wagner was virtually wiped out in Bakhmut for no strategic gain at all, no military gain, no operational gain. So at the moment, they're pouring lots and lots of people into that for some strange, misunderstood reason. They seem to be prepared to lose all their equipment, tanks, armor, artillery, air defense systems, and men, and they're not gaining very much. And even if they did manage to take the town of Advivka, it wouldn't make a difference to the battlefield situation strategically.
How long could it take for the Russian side to lose all men and all equipment on the ground, and how long could it take for the Ukrainian army to destroy their own equipment or weapons and or personnel in Ukraine?
That's an extremely difficult question to answer, but I don't think that the aim of the armed forces is to completely destroy the Russian armed forces. It's to stop Russia from having the ability to maintain war. And so their economy is just as important as defeating their troops on the front line. Once Russia is no longer able to maintain war, an operational war, at that time they will start to want to negotiate. And there are already small signs that they want to negotiate now. And they're claiming that Ukraine doesn't want to negotiate. But, you know, your leaders are not that foolish. They know that at the moment they're just looking for a rest. But eventually they will ask to negotiate because they will realize that it's no longer possible for them to maintain war. And that's the objective.
President Zelensky says that Russia cannot wage war against Ukraine from a strategic point of view, like strategically. Do you support such point?
Yeah, I understand what he means. He actually is talking about the far bigger picture. And again, that relies on their ability to produce ammunition, to produce vehicles, to produce tanks, to produce aircraft, and replace the ones they're losing. And that's the strategic level at which they can't maintain, which is, again, why they've opened a second front using Iran and Hamas.
NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg urges Western allies to prepare for a long war in Ukraine. What is the best key to win a long war of attrition?
The key to winning a long war of attrition is the industrial military complex, is to make sure that you can manufacture all the material for war that you need for a long term. So it means you've got to up your industry. You've got to produce more weapons. You've got to produce weapons faster than you lose them. You've got to train your men. You've got to enlarge your armies. And you've got to make yourself so strong that the enemy realize that eventually they cannot outfight you. They cannot outmanufacture you. And there's no choice but to negotiate a settlement.
Recently, you said that Ukraine has won a firefight in the war in Ukraine. What does it mean for Ukraine's war efforts?
Well, in all battlefield situations, once you engage with the enemy, you have to win the firefight. Now, that could be a section of 10 men engaging a small enemy trench, or it can be a whole army coming to the front. But what you have to do eventually is you have to suppress the enemy's fire so that you can maneuver. And Ukraine has managed to suppress the Russian artillery fire. Up until the last month, the Russians were managing to fire more artillery, more ammunition at Ukraine than Ukraine was managing to respond with. But that's just recently changed. Ukraine is now firing more ammunition at Russia than Russia can return, which means that Ukraine is winning the firefight. It's suppressing the enemy fire. It's defeating their communications. It's defeating their air defenses. It's defeating their artillery. And consequently, it's beginning to get a strong upper hand, which frees them up to maneuver the armed forces in ways that are going to win the battle strategically.
Since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Ukraine has successfully destroyed 20 Russian warships and 1 submarine. Is it possible to say that Ukraine is winning the Battle of the Black Sea?
Yeah, Ukraine has almost completely won the Battle of the Black Sea with its marine drones, with its waterborne drones. For a country without a navy, it's performed marvelously within the limitations that it has, with the scientists, with the technicians, with the people that put these drones into effect. They've actually taught Russia that it doesn't matter how many battleships and how many corvettes and how many capital ships they have at sea, they're vulnerable to these smaller effective devices. And so they've had to withdraw their Black Fleet. And so that can be seen as a major strategic victory at sea. Ukraine is taking back control of the western part of the Black Sea.
How could it influence the ground situation in Ukraine?
Well, it affects supply, especially in Crimea. While the ports were open, while they could ship material across Kerch Bridge and by sea in Sevastopol, then they were able to maintain their armed forces in Crimea. Now that's going to prove incredibly difficult. And with the long-range ATACMS that have come in, the Ukraine can probably hit the Kerch Bridge at any time it actually wishes to. General Ben Hodges has said that Crimea is the key, and I wholeheartedly agree with him. When Crimea is completely isolated, then Russia will have effectively lost the war.
I would like to also cover Israel-Hamas war. How do you see its impact on the war in Ukraine and on the world's global order?
Well, Russia wants this second front to start. It's my belief, and it's been supported by Antony Blinken and by Lloyd Austin in recent announcements, that they believe too, the Americans believe too, that this new front that has begun with the attack by Hamas on Israel was directly prompted and agreed between Russia and Iran to draw the world's eye away from what's going on in Ukraine, to reduce the amount of support that the Americans especially are going to supply to Ukraine. But the Americans are very, very aware of this. They know what the game is, the big game on the big world board, and they know why this distraction has been put there. So it might affect Ukraine, it might affect the supply, but I think the people at the very, very top in the USA, and I listened to Secretary Blinken today, and he said he hasn't forgotten about Ukraine. Ukraine is the key. And it's a wonderful thing, a few days after I've written it, to find somebody of that importance saying exactly what I said a few days ago.
Could Russia also be behind the recent escalation in the Middle East?
Yeah, I think Russia is directly responsible through negotiation to sacrifice Gaza and Hamas in order to try to give themselves breathing space in Ukraine. That's the whole purpose of this attack at this time.
I would like also to cover your latest book called Slav Ukraini. Could you please provide us with some insight into your new book?
Yeah, Slava Ukraini, Who Dares Shares, is a combination of your battle cry and where or how I finish my daily reports about Ukraine, and Who Dares Shares has become pretty much my key phrase. Before the war began and the Russians were building up on the Belarus border, I was writing, I was almost screaming on social media, saying, look, they're going to come across, they're going to invade, somebody's got to sit up and do something. But the Americans were talking about President number 45, the British were talking about Boris Johnson's Christmas party, and the Australians were talking about Djokovic being deported for breaking COVID rules. and nobody seemed to be paying attention to it. And then only a couple of weeks later, across the border they came with their advance on Kyiv. And I was extremely frustrated and angry about it. So I started writing about it every single day. And a lot of the things that I've said since then, not everything, but a lot of things that I've said and written since then have turned out to become the facts, and they've become true. I like to warn, I like to remind the world. And after 20 months, what I did is I collated all the information that I've put out over the last 20 months into an observational diary, which is Slav Ukraini, who dares shares. And it's there, it's out now, it's on Amazon, and it's there to remind people how important this war is to Ukraine and to the whole Western world.
Why did you decide to write this book, and what is the key idea of your latest book?
I think why I wrote it is because I could see the terrible injustice that's being carried out by Russia against Ukraine. Russia, to remind everybody, invaded a sovereign state. It tried to place a puppet government into a sovereign state that was moving stronger, more and more strongly towards democracy. And he didn't like that. It wasn't the threat of NATO that Russia was worried about. It was the threat of democracy. It was a threat of the ideology of the Western world on its borders that it was really scared of, losing control. And that made me extremely frustrated and extremely angry. And the best way to vent my anger as a 66-year-old man was to write about it, to use the power of words to make people remember. And this book is exactly part of that process. It's something I'm very proud of.
Thank you, Mr. Horsfall, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава. Thank you very much.